So Dr. Rebecca Willbanks got her PhD from Stanford and did her postdoc at Johns Hopkins, where she is currently a lecturer. And as you can tell from the title of her talk, her work speaks to everyone in this room. So her work looks at the intersection of bioethics and speculative fiction and STS, and so there will be something for everyone, I'm sure, in this talk, and I am very excited to hear it. So please join me in welcoming Rebecca. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, so thank you so much, Ruth, and for all your help in organizing this visit. Thanks to Dave Guston and Ben Hurlbut for instigating this visit. I'm so happy to be here, and I really couldn't imagine a better audience for this talk, so I'm really looking forward to the discussion and feedback. So this presentation is drawn from my current book project, Life's Imagined Futures, the Speculative Science and Speculative Fiction of Synthetic Biology. And this project draws on my background in literary criticism and science and technology studies, or STS, to consider changing depictions of biotechnology in literature alongside insights gleaned from my participant observation in a biohacker space, interviews with synthetic biologists, and analysis of scientific papers and historical documents. The book focuses on the origins of synthetic biology, a field that emerged around the turn of the millennium with the goal of making biology easy to engineer. This academic field is also associated with the emergence of a do-it-yourself biology movement, or as it's sometimes called, biohacking initiatives that aim to democratize biotechnology, or in other words, to make its tools more accessible to non-professionals such as hobbyists, entrepreneurs, or independent researchers. Synthetic biology has been defined from the start by its future vision, a shared imaginary of a world in which life could be programmed in a predictable and reliable fashion, much like computer code is written today. In such a world, some imagined, children would design their own mini dinosaurs as pets, the human genetic code could be scrambled to make humans immune to all viruses, and people could hack their microbiome to create skin bacteria with customized scents, to take just a few examples. And if biology in the natural world was too context-dependent and complicated to rigorously model, let alone reliably engineer, then synthetic biologists would change the natural world to make it modelable through innovations like the Library of Standardized Biological Parts. So this fantasy of making biology easy to engineer defines synthetic biology more than the methods that it uses, which are drawn from earlier pre-existing areas of research and practice, such as metabolic engineering and genetic engineering. In the field of science and technology studies, this type of richly imagined collective future vision is described as a socio-technical imaginary, a term that's meant to express the way in which imagined futures involving science and technology also carry with them underlying values and normative ideas about the common good. In STS, imaginaries have become a popular analytic for exploring the speculative and promissory dimensions of science and technology. However, until recently, STS scholars haven't paid that much attention to how science fiction's imagined futures might contribute to broader socio-technical imaginaries. Literary scholars of science fiction, meanwhile, often study science fiction as symptomatic or critical of a dominant socio-technical imaginary, but less often as an active agent in shaping it. However, works of science fiction not only record and critique the socio-technical visions of a given era, they're also objects within a culture that wield influence, as CSI recognizes. And so I'm particularly interested in Project Hieroglyph and some of the more recent collections that have been coming out of CSI as what I call incantatory fiction, so fictions that are meant to produce effects in the real world. Writers and critics have long argued that SF is a didactic genre, but increasingly I think it's being asked to do rather than teach, that is to bring about or ward off real-world states of affairs. So what theory of science fiction or science fiction and social change do these projects imply? In Project Hieroglyph, Neil Stephenson theorized the connection between SF and innovation through the notion of the hieroglyph. So SF builds an imagined world around a technology, and the technological object comes to serve as shorthand for the imagined world or innovation. So these imagined technologies, Stephenson said, such as Asimov's robots, Heinlein's rocket ships, or Gibson's cyberspace, are simple, recognizable symbols whose significance everyone agrees on. They give others a goal to work towards. Now, it might not be surprising that a science fiction author would come up with a theory that seems to assign a lot of importance to science fiction authors as principal architects of this vision that others work to realize. Yet, in my research with synthetic biologists and biohackers, I found that many of them are avid readers of science fiction. So, for example, when I visited the company Ginkgo Bioworks, I asked one of the employers whether she and her colleagues read SF, and she said, of course, we're all nerds. I found that many scientists, engineers, and self-described biohackers did look to science fiction to make sense of the social ramifications of their research, and to imagine what biology could be in the 21st century and beyond, and to seek inspiration. So in this presentation, I'll use the origins of synthetic biology as a case study to think about how science fiction and scientific practice are interrelated. If there is a hieroglyph in this story, it's the idea of biohacking, this idea that life could be programmed like computer code. I'll demonstrate how reframing genetic engineering as biohacking created an activity with a new set of emotional resonances, and this happened through exchanges between science fiction authors and scientists. Contra Stephenson's definition, I don't think that this hieroglyph has a simple or universally agreed on meaning, but I do think that science fiction contributed to producing meaning and emotional resonance around this technological symbol within a particular social context that I'll describe. So this talk will include some close analysis of fiction by the science fiction author Rudy Rucker, and I'll talk about how some of his ideas traveled into synthetic biology, focusing particularly on the synthetic biologist Drew Endy. And then finally, I'll end very briefly with a work of science fiction that shows a path not taken for synthetic biology, in order to suggest that science fiction doesn't just help us better understand synthetic biology as it did emerge historically, but it can also be a creative tool for imagining how it could have been or could still be otherwise. Okay, so Drew Endy is one of the founding members of synthetic biology, was often described as a leading evangelist of the field, especially in its early years. You could call him a visioneer, which is the historian Patrick McRae's term for researchers who connect their technical expertise in science and technology to expansive visions of the future and promote those visions to a wider public in order to lay the foundations for their realization. In 2005, he chose science fiction as the medium for synthetic biology's coming out to the broader scientific community. Adventures in Synthetic Biology, a graphic narrative published in Nature alongside Endy's more traditional article, Foundations for Engineering Biology, follows a young boy named Dude as he learns to reprogram the genetic code of bacteria and gets into mischief. Endy grew up on a diet of science fiction. In an interview, he told me that his consumption of science fiction was particularly high during two periods in his life. First as a child, before he entered college, and second, during his postdoctoral years at the Molecular Sciences Institute, a privately funded nonprofit research institute in Berkeley, where he was affiliated from 1998 to 2001. Historian Luis Campos locates the roots of synthetic biology in discussions that took place at the MSI during those years, in which Endy, Roger Brent, and Rob Carlson came up with the phrase synthetic biology to describe what they were envisioning. Before Endy moved to MIT, where he helped to lay the institutional foundations for synthetic biology, he was part of what he describes as, quote, a techno-nerd community at the frontier, struggling to figure out where the vectors should be pointed. The group at the Molecular Sciences Institute, in his words, devoured science fiction as they tried to figure out what post-genomic biology should look like. And they invited science fiction authors to the earliest synthetic biology meetings. One of those authors was Rudy Rucker. So Rucker claims that he brought cyberpunk to the Bay Area when he moved there in 1986 to accept a job as a professor of computer science at San Jose State University. The cyberpunk subgenre in science fiction, for those who aren't familiar, is associated with shifting science fiction's gaze from outer space to everyday life in near future gritty and dystopic worlds. And it's especially concerned with the interface between bodies and machines. For example, cyberpunk gave us the concept of cyberspace. From the start, however, there was oh, it's okay, it's supposed to be blank. Yeah, no worries. There was an interest in biotechnology from the start. So Rudy Rucker and other cyberpunk affiliated authors such as Greg Bear and Bruce Sterling saw biology as a substrate that could potentially be programmed. With this realization, they created the idea of biohacking by drawing together a number of pre-existing elements. So first, the idea of programming life is already implicit in the metaphor of the genetic program inherited from molecular biology and the development of recombinant DNA technology since the 70s. Other influential elements in this mix included the Silicon Valley hacking culture and new theories about complex systems that were gaining traction during this period. And finally, the science fiction tradition that the cyberpunks were self-consciously intervening in. Rucker's best-known work, The Ware Tetralogy, demonstrates the emergence of these ideas over the course of the series. So software came out in 1982, wetware in 1988, freeware in 1997, and realware in 2000. The first two are Philip K. Dick Award winners and considered part of the cyberpunk canon. But unlike the noir-inflected, melancholic, and chilly atmosphere of many cyberpunk novels, Rucker's fictions are absurd, zany, humorous, and often earnest. For example, some of the beings who populate these novels include boppers, intelligent robots that have escaped human control to colonize the moon, and feezers, or freaky geezers, elderly baby boomers who have been ceded the state of Florida as an appeasement from the government after Social Security runs out. The Ware Tetralogy displays two features that are also found in other biohacking narratives. So first, it describes a process in which biology and technology merge. They're brought closer together and they take on characteristics of each other so that biology comes to be seen as always already technological and technology undergoes a vitalization, taking on features of life. Second, the series highlights concerns about individual autonomy, picking up on a fascination that runs through a number of earlier science fiction texts, this idea that over the course of evolution, humans could be bound up into larger superorganismic structures. So for example, Software, the first novel, involves the emergence of large robots that try to bring both smaller robots and humans under centralized control in one giant super robot human superorganism. And this theme just repeats and intensifies over the course of the series. This recurrent trope of the superorganism in science fiction registers the social anxieties of its time. And in cyberpunk, the superorganisms tend to be associated with shadowy, ill-defined transnational corporations that have co-opted part or all of the state apparatus. So enter the biohacker hero, or maybe anti-hero, a figure who's often a brilliant but emotionally immature young man that can partially resolve this tension by standing in relation to the larger bodies without being completely determined by them. Okay. In Rucker's work, the treatment of the superorganism theme is also inflected by new theories about life and the relationship between parts and wholes that stem from Rucker's interest in the emerging science of complex systems that was developing in the 80s and 90s around the Santa Fe Institute. Complexity science studies systems that are composed of many interacting parts and highlights the way in which ordered behavior appears to spontaneously emerge in certain kinds of complex systems. And in this literature, it kind of became a lens to theorize the social dimensions of synthetic biology. So for example, more recently, synthetic biologist George Church illustrates this when he writes that the combination of humans and technology together forms a computationally irreducible system, and that's a technical term from complexity theory that implies the impossibility of predicting and thus the challenge of controlling humans and technology together. In Rucker's novels and in Silicon Valley during this period, these ideas about complex systems were applied to economics. Freeware, the third novel in the trilogy in particular, reflects the way in which they were adapted in 1990s Silicon Valley. Written near the height of the dot-com bubble, freeware is a paean to the new economy, a term associated with the euphoric discourse about the coming of post-industrial society, popularized by Wired magazine and pundits writing about the economic effects of technology. In the new economy, workers could creatively and independently pursue their interests at the same time they enriched the company's bottom line. And Freeware, the novel, embellishes a cycle of creative destruction as this new hybrid, half biological, half inorganic life form destroys and replaces the earlier silicon robots, allowing enterprising hackers to get rich. So Rucker's work places genetic engineering within a narrative that draws together several features. This idea that life and technology are converging, a dramatic tension that revolves around struggles for autonomy, created by new possibilities for control, and new theories about complex systems that were applied to both life and economics and helped to ease that fear that merging of life and technology would impinge on individual autonomy. Rucker's work was influenced by the culture of Silicon Valley, and it was also taken up by members of the tech community who valued science fiction as a form of prognostication. Rucker's book Saucer Wisdom, which came out in 1999, compresses the technological developments of the Ware tetralogy into one book, and it was originally commissioned by Wired magazine editor Mark Frauenfelder as a work of speculative, as a nonfiction work of speculative futurology, although the style is equally kind of loony and absurdist as the Ware tetralogy. It involves flying saucers, as the title indicates. When the Wired Books division folded, the text was picked up by science fiction publisher Tor, where it continued to be marketed as nonfiction science writing rather than science fiction. In 2000, Rucker received an invitation to present at the After the Genome conferences organized by the Molecular Sciences Institute, where Drew Endy was a fellow. At this conference, he presented excerpts from Saucer Wisdom to an audience of scientists and biotechnology industry professionals. In the following years, specific ideas from this text began to appear in Endy's speech as he began to promote the new field of synthetic biology through interviews in the mass media. So one idea was this, the idea that in the future people will live in programmable gourd houses. And another more significant idea that appears in Saucer Wisdom before 2000, before then appearing in the scientific literature as one of the hallmarks of Endy's approach to synthetic biology, is the idea of the abstraction hierarchy. This idea of creating a biological version of this system that computer scientists use. And the abstraction hierarchy is one of the key points of his Endy's 2005 Nature publication. And which, as far as I know, is the first instance of it appearing in the scientific literature, and that paper is now one of the most oft-cited works in synthetic biology. So the abstraction hierarchy is a socio-technical innovation from computer science that enables engineers to work at one level of a system while maintaining a degree of ignorance about other levels. So for example, a programmer can write code in a programming language without concerning themselves with how that code would be translated into the machine language of the computer, which is a process that happens automatically. So following this model, Endy's vision for synthetic biology imagined bioengineers using the abstraction hierarchy to build genetic devices and systems without having to worry about the chemistry of DNA synthesis or the specifics of DNA sequences. Instead, they could request higher order parts based on their function. The same idea can be found in Rucker's Saucer Wisdom. So in Saucer Wisdom's depiction of the abstraction hierarchy, two researchers who are playfully named Gene and Jean use a virtual reality model of the bumblebee genome to design a new bumblebee. And they move between abstraction level 1, which represents the DNA itself, to higher levels that represent physical and finally behavioral traits in order to design a bumblebee that's customized to target Gene's obnoxious neighbor. So these ideas about making bioengineering more like computer programming, and as well as the playful tone in which they were presented in Saucer Wisdom, are not unique to Rucker's work either, but took shape across a range of fictional and speculative nonfiction works. So Rucker's Abstraction Hierarchy was inspired by the writings of Freeman Dyson, who's a physicist and futurist who has been dubbed the patron saint of biohacking. In Dyson's book, Imagine Worlds, he talks about abstraction in genetic programming languages, although he doesn't use the term abstraction hierarchy. Gregory Benford, a physicist and SF author who also reviewed Imagine Worlds, echoes Rucker's wetware with his term liveware, and both authors imagine endearing and zany consumer products based on biotech. The idea of plant-based architecture and design your own pets are common tropes. And by 1997, the idea that biotech will be to the coming century what electronics had been for the one now passing had become common sense to a certain crowd. Everyone says that, proclaims Wired's report on that year's After the Genome Conference. These borrowings and repetitions are characteristic of SF. So the genre of SF as a whole is sometimes described as a megatext, a term introduced by Damien Broderick to mark SF's highly intertextual nature. In this case, the megatext spanned literature and speculative science such that the designations fiction and nonfiction provide little purchase. At the same time, scientists and real-world networks played a role in selecting which of these texts circulated within this group. So texts circulating within this community shared many of the theoretical assumptions and the tone that spoke to 1990s Silicon Valley and the intellectual conversation produced by media entities such as Wired and John Brockman's Edge Foundation. So when we take into account the role of science fiction as it circulated within these already existing networks, its effects were both very productive at inspiring new areas of inquiry, but also somewhat limited in how ideas and assumptions were reinforced through the selection of certain kinds of texts. In other words, science fiction served as a source of novelty, but within certain bounds. In reframing genetic engineering as biohacking narratives such as Rucker's wear technology made it into an activity with a new kind of affect or emotional charge that might best be described as enchantment. So the idea that modern science and technology contribute to a more rational but disenchanted society was most influentially put forward by Max Weber in 1917. Disenchantment, Weber explains in Science as a Vocation, means that even if one does not know how the complex technologies around us work, one believes that principally there are no mysterious, incalculable forces that come into play, but rather that one can in principle master all things by calculation. With the goal of controlling life at the molecular level through standardization and abstraction, synthetic biology would seem to be the ultimate disenchantment. But as we've already seen, the theories of complexity through which life was being simultaneously interpreted actually kind of counterbalance this. So paradoxically, ever finer control of matter in synthetic biology was interpreted as producing irreducible complexity at the social level. And making life and matter programmable, in fact, meant that everything is changeable. In the Ware tetralogy, Rucker transmutes this changeability into a sense of enchantment, a word that signals both captivating delight as well as the possibility of being put under a spell, as literary critic Michael Saylor notes. Enchantment is thus inherently linked to issues of control. In the Ware tetralogy, the joining together of biology and technology leads to a sense of enchantment as imaginary figures become enfleshed and quotidian objects are not what they seem. So for example, one of the hackers in freeware brings Lewis Carroll's fictional creatures to life, including the Tove, the Borough and the Jabberwock itself. While another of the series' absurdities involves a Mr. Frosty truck that has been commandeered and retooled by a robot who wants to eat human brains to upload their minds. In this world, Mr. Frosty might be a brain-eating robot who will still sell you a chocolate dip cone, and you might be reborn as a robot remote controlled by Mr. Frosty. This sense of enchantment is often reinforced by Rucker's cadence, short rhyming sentences depicting simple but vivid analogies that sometimes approach the style of a fairy tale or children's book. Like being a snail in a 10-ton shell, a snowball in hell. Okay. So while brain-eating robots don't sound exactly delightful, this unexpected animation of a quotidian object in a way that includes a potential for danger is a kind of enchantment. I observed a similar kind of enchantment and playfulness in the DIY bio community. So in 2014, I joined the Real Vegan Cheese Project, a biohacking project in the Bay Area, as a participant observer. And the goal of this project was to make real vegan cheese by engineering yeast to produce milk proteins. But at the same time, the group also imagined making human cheese and real vegan narwhal cheese. Why? As one participant put it, because we can, and because it's the closest we can get to unicorn cheese. A journalist who reported on the project wrote approvingly, "I'm sure synthetic biology can get weirder, but this is a great start." And that's a reference to Endy's quote, who said, "Let's keep synthetic biology weird." So I think as the biohackers were kind of running through all the different kinds of cheeses they could make just by downloading different sequences, there's a similar kind of magic trick in changing one thing into another. Yet one of the things that close reading of the biohacking fictions with their cyberpunk roots make clear is that this value of playfulness gains its value within a system in which there's an underlying fear of incorporation and control by corporate entities within a capitalist system. And many biohacking projects, including Real Vegan Cheese, stressed values of autonomy and self-determination in the face of these concerns. Similarly, the origins of the Molecular Sciences Institute in the midst of intense debates about scientific autonomy suggest a kind of structural similarity to the position of the biohacker in science fiction that could indicate why it resonated with ND. So the Molecular Sciences Institute was founded in 1996 by the Nobel Prize-winning molecular biologist and geneticist Sidney Brenner. And it was originally incorporated as the Philip Morris Institute for Molecular Sciences, thanks to the largest single grant ever given by a tobacco company. Corporations like Philip Morris were interested in funding genetics research because they saw it as a potential confounding variable in the relationship between smoking and cancer. So the birth of the Institute caused immediate controversy within the scientific community, and within a year that funding agreement had been terminated, the name changed, and the MSI opened in Berkeley, where it would instead receive support from NIH and DARPA, or Department of Defense. In the Ware tetralogy, the construction of the biohacker as the boy who never grows up is related to concerns about who and what ultimately steers the development of science and technology. So hapless characters are often drawn into the machinations of larger entities, such as corporations or other more figurative kind of superorganisms. The hacker's facility with tools and his seeming disinterest in material wealth allow him to retain some degree of autonomy, even as he's deeply connected to these larger entities with their own agendas. In this respect, the biohacker in Rucker's fiction bears some resemblance to the early synthetic biologists at MSI, whose work was enabled by these institutions, including Philip Morris and the DoD, and to hacking culture more broadly, which is similarly entangled with military and corporate interests. ND describes the intellectual freedom he felt at the MSI by saying that the group had, quote, very little adult supervision and no formal institutional structure. Synthetic biology today continues to exemplify the convergence of academic research and entrepreneurship that characterizes domains like biotechnology. And in this context, the values of playfulness and creativity can be a way of reaffirming to oneself or to others the purity of one's motivations. The construction of the biohacker as a playful boy, inherited from science fiction such as the Ware tetralogy, both celebrates and downplays his agency in contradictory swings between total mastery on the one hand and between framing technology as outside of human control on the other. It's also worth considering how affect, as Sarah Ahmed argues, can work to align some subjects with some others and against other others. So biohacking narratives from the Ware tetralogy to ND's Adventures in Synthetic Biology often pit a playful boy against a female figure who serves as the voice of caution and urges him to think about the consequences of her actions. Narratively, her role is that she unsuccessfully tries to stop the forward motion of technology that's necessary for the plot to develop. So on this slide, the character Dude in synthetic biology is releasing his living toy that he's constructed into the world behind his teacher's back. In this way, biohacking narratives feminize ethics. Making the figure of the synthetic biologist into a playful boy creates a moral economy that implicitly enshrines a cultivated naivete about the larger systems of which one is a part and an optimistic uncertainty about what one's creations will do once released into the world. During the same period that biohacking emerged as one way of imagining the future of biotechnology, other fictions about bioengineering that departed from this model were also produced. And so in the last part of this talk, I want to mention an alternate imagining of biotechnology from the same period that entails a different kind of ethical calculus and a different kind of bioengineering ethos. And I think that one reason that this fiction and some other fictions that are thematizing similar material did not find their way into the early framing of synthetic biology was because the authors weren't part of this community of practice that spanned mostly hard SF authors, many with degrees in physics or mathematics, and Silicon Valley tech enthusiasts in which these ideas were circulating. So at the same time that Rucker was writing his Where novels, Joan Slonczewski was also envisioning a world in which technology becomes biological. Door into Ocean, published in 1986, imagines a feminist eco-utopia on a watery world called Shora, an ocean moon in which the all-female inhabitants, or sharers, dwell on living rafts. Sharers possess a sophisticated ability to manipulate biology at the molecular level, which they call life-shaping. At the time of publication, Slonczewski was a professor of microbiology at Kenyon College, a position that she still holds today. Although microbes play an important role in her work, the key difference of this imagined world is more of a cultural innovation than a biological one. So Sharer society is based on principles of nonviolence and reciprocity to the extent that all verbs have a reciprocal structure, so there's no distinction between subjects and objects. And this is based on the idea that all actions have a equal and opposite reaction. So for example, consider the phrase, she hit it. A sharer would say, if you hit something, don't you also feel the force in your hand? So the verb to hit in share would translate to something like sharing force. Slonczewski's novel sets up a fascinating thought experiment by trying to imagine bioengineering through a conceptual framework that is vastly different from our own. The novel asks, what would it mean to think of genetic engineering as involving reciprocity? Could it ever be more than the imposition of human will onto nature? Although both life-shaping and biohacking involve genetic modification, they're not the same thing. Biohacking frames genetic engineering with an appeal to the total freedom and potentiality of the imagination. The metaphor with computer programming here is central. Coding is figured as connecting the realm of pure thought or information with matter in a way that's almost magical. Media studies scholar Wendy Chun described coding understood in this way as a fetish that creates a subject with magical powers to transform words into things. Or as Drew Endy described in his vision for synthetic biology, just sit down at your laptop and type out the letters and out comes your organism. In contrast, sharers have never had silicon technology in Slonczewski's work, so this analogy is absent. The verb to shape implies a physical process rather than one of immaterial labor. And most importantly, sharer society embodies reciprocity with a non-human environment, which is expressed in their prohibition against terraforming worlds. Rather than destroying all the native flora and fauna on Shora, their ocean planet, the sharers change their own biology to fit into the ecosystem. And their most defining act of body modification signals this way in which changing self and changing other are thought of together. So they have life-shaped these symbiotic microbes to live in their cells and release oxygen into their tissues so they can stay underwater longer. In contrast to the anxiety that ideas about symbiosis and superorganisms evoke in the Ware tetralogy, on Shora they're treated more matter-of-factly. And in part, this is due to this fundamentally different conception of agency, in which every action is an interaction. This helps to dampen the wild oscillations between control by self and control by others that drive the biohacking narrative in Rucker's text. Instead, Slonczewski's shares suggest that humans have always been bound up in larger entities and contained others within themselves, that this need not be understood as a battle for control, but simply as the codependence that is the condition of all earthly lives. At the same time, while this all sounds very happy, and I may have made the shares sound like ethical paragons or perhaps even noble savages living in balance with nature, the sequel to Door into Ocean does call into question the ethical purity of Share society. So it's revealed that when the shares entered Shore's ecosystem, in fact, around 90% of the native species did go extinct, and the ones that remained were drastically altered. So some characters question whether this is really different than terraforming. Despite the ethical ambiguity, these different biotech futures generate very different kinds of ethics or ethical questions. Biohacking narratives pit a desire to generate novelty and further the creative evolution of life against this fear that merging life and technology might create new possibilities to violate the autonomy of humans and human-like others. Fundamentally, they ask, can the biohacker surf the wave of technology's chaotic growth, or will he become an appendage of new biotechnical forms of life? In contrast, in Slonczewski's ecocentric worldview, it's impossible to alter another component of the system without altering oneself as well. Slonczewski's novel doesn't offer a roadmap for future biology, but it does change the kinds of questions that are asked. And particularly, I think it suggests a kind of ethics that is not about thinking about the consequences of one's actions, but a different ethical temporality, such as the notion of responsibility suggested by feminist STS scholar Karen Barad, in which responsibility is taking account of the entangled materializations of which we are already a part. Slonczewski's work also subtly redistributes the value that's placed on life as it is now. That is the creatures that already share our Earth versus life as it could be, which is the sheer potentiality that drives synthetic biology's imagined futures in biohacking narratives. So where does this leave us with hieroglyph theory, where I started? Scientists and biohackers, I found, did look to science fiction for inspiration and found it. But if hieroglyph theory suggests that this inspirational vision can be traced to the mind of a single author, I've shown that it makes more sense to think of these ideas as developing collectively through a megatext of works that include science fiction and nonfiction, and communities of practice that spanned scientists and science fiction authors. Yet, as former CSI affiliate Manjana Milkorit points out, despite their fundamentally collective nature, socio-technical imaginaries are always instantiated in individual minds, and so rather than thinking about it being one or the other, we need to think about the relationship between the individual imagination and collective imaginaries. And so in particular, I think this case study can help us think about the origins of socio-technical imaginaries. Tracing the way in which visioneers such as Endy drew on previously established narrative frameworks, we can understand the development of socio-technical imaginaries not as a matter of spreading and institutionally embedding the visions of an individual or a small group, but as a recursive process in which individuals draw on prior shared framings, articulating them in new ways and in different contexts. And in particular, I see how the context of science fiction, explicit references to science fiction were more present in the very early stages of discussion among this community, and then were left out as the socio-technical imaginary became moved into the embedding stage where it was speaking to broader audiences. So this case study provides empirical support for Milkorit's hypothesis that science fiction can be a source of novelty for the technopolitical imagination. At the same time, real-world communities of practice also help determine what kinds of science fiction are brought into different spaces. So Rucker's fiction provided a source of novelty, but it also fit with many ideas that were already circulating in 1990s Silicon Valley. This selection may, in part, also have to do with the different ways that different communities of practice read science fiction. So many scientists and technology developers that I've encountered who read science fiction and think about it in relation to their work often treat it as being about the future, or even as kind of like a guide to the future. And that's the inspirational kind of model that Stephenson is suggesting. But in contrast, in different communities of practice within science fiction, such as the academic community of science fiction studies, and more also in the world of feminist science fiction, the focus has often been more on the way in which science fiction generates imagined worlds that are strategically different from our own in order to critically analyze the present. To the extent that it relies on the inspirational power of a technological object or innovation as a goal to work towards, hieroglyph theory in practice can assume a background of shared meaning that makes this goal desirable. Biohacking narratives, such as Rucker's, wove together both positive and negative affects, but ultimately fears about individual autonomy gave way to the idea that the merging of life and technology is ultimately inevitable and good. So despite the anxieties of enchantment, biohacking narratives remain optimistic, and this is in part because the biohacker's social standpoint allows him to maintain a degree of autonomy within this chaotic change that his inventions catalyze. Within the Ware tetralogy, female characters often fare much worse. And similarly, if you look at other writers, such as Octavia Butler's Lilith's Brood trilogy that are writing at this time, they're considering similar technologies, but they have a drastically different emotional tone and take on the technology. So when it comes to incantatory fictions, works that are commissioned to have an impact on the present, I'm particularly interested in those like Carl Schroeder's contribution to the original project Hieroglyph that don't take the meaning of technology for granted, but rather imagine socio-technical innovations that attempt to build shared meaning in a context of seemingly intractable differences. By engaging the full spectrum of contemporary SF and cross-pollinating between different communities of practice that might not otherwise share ideas, incantatory fictions have the potential to both enrich both the SF genre and the real-world practices at which they're directed. And I'm really looking forward to reading the new collection of future tense fiction. So thank you.
Plenty of time for questions.
So I really appreciate your discussion of the ways, particularly like in these like comic book propaganda piece was like super gendered and the gendered like relations throughout them. It brought to mind a conversation I had with some biohackers like a year ago who were talking about the new form that transhumanism is apparently taking, according to them, which is that it's like a lot less about the humanism and a lot more about the trans, and that like the most of like the closest available thing to actually biohack, according to these folks, is gender. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how this fits in with that particular change.
Yeah, I know. I'm aware one biohacking project that I'm aware of in that vein is the open source gender codes project from a few years ago, which is kind of an art project. I guess Mary Magic is also working on that. Yeah, but I think I would be interested to hear more about your experiences with those. The biohackers that I was working with, that the topic of gender engineering didn't come up so much. But I think that it's an area where there is probably, I would be interested to see if there was more cross-pollination between other types of science fiction. And I think in particular their science fiction is so much more, like the diversity of science fiction is much more visible than it was in the 90s. So there's a lot more out there that's very visible, that's dealing with issues of gender in interesting ways and specific ways and theoretically sophisticated ways. So I would be interested to see if they were inspired or engaging with that at all. I don't know, did you have any thoughts? Or?
I'm struggling to remember if anything like that came up. It seemed much more like their sort of body hacking, body modification, synthetic biology, and like overlap subculture emerged a lot out of just a lot out of the trans community and that like present political struggle. So.
Yeah, and that theme does go actually far back in science fiction too. So yeah, interesting. Thanks. Yeah.
So I found it really interesting to hear you talk about the ways in which the narrative was constructed around control and how much of that came from the science fiction into the biohacking. Have you looked at all or seen anything in terms of the now existing embedded ethos of biohacking in turn changing the way science fiction is conducted and presented? Do you see that cycle kind of feeding off itself?
The embedded aspect of science fiction, or can you say a little more about that?
If a lot of the ethos of the biohacking community was in part originally inspired by science fiction, and then which once embedded, less present. Do we now see the biohacking transferring to the science fiction coming out today?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I think that with that process I was talking about, where it became less, the science fiction references became less visible, that was more with institutionalized synthetic biology than with the biohacking communities. But in terms of what does the influence go the other way, I think that the more recent wave, a lot of 21st century science fiction, kind of after, that was produced after the first wave of synthetic biology, was a lot more dystopic. So works like Paolo Bacigalupi's The Wind-Up Girl, and often when I talk to synthetic biologists, they would say, why is science fiction so gloomy, right? Like, kind of like we've seen now the turn going in the other direction to kind of, I think in a lot of domains, there's been a desire to now move away from dystopia. But I think after that, the work, like I was discussing with that kind of techno-optimism that came out of the techno-optimism of the 90s, there was, along with like broader cultural shifts, there was a kind of more darker turn around technology. And now I think people are trying to push, a lot of writers too are trying to push back against that and avoid falling into the easy tropes of dystopia. Yeah, so Ben.
So thanks for a really interesting talk. So the two things that I was really interested in were your discussion of disenchantment and reenchantment, and then your imagination imaginaries discussion. Yeah. So if you take, there's a sense in which, when Weber says, disenchanted modernity, this is sort of naming or channeling a kind of imaginary of modernity.
Yeah.
And it seems you're seeing exactly right that there's a sort of an imagination of reenchantment that's animating the Drew Endy vision and so on and so forth. But one of the things that's striking about it is that not only is there a kind of interplay between science fiction narratives and the self-cultivation of the identity of the field and of the people who occupy the field, but like nature will publish it. So there is some moment of transition that Drew Endy has been seen as representing, not simply asserting that he represents, but has been recognized somehow as representing. So the kind of imagination of what the century of biology is going to be does seem to have uptake in some sort of imaginary of what, you know, this, I don't want to use post-modernity, but what the sort of re-enchanted, the post-disenchantment project of technological re-enchantment of life is. And I mean, there's an appetite for it. So anyway, I wonder if you would say something about that, all the part, you know, the sort of actors in your picture who are not the consumers of science fiction, and yet in effect are the consumers of science fiction because they'll print Drew Endy's weird little graphic novel in Nature magazine. Just pretty weird.
Yeah, I think it definitely goes way beyond synthetic biology in terms of how a lot of people are thinking about just technology, but kind of that same narrative was shaping the emergence of synthetic biology, and that technology in general, not just biotechnology, but biotechnology being a kind of like symbolically important part of that, was being described in a very vitalistic way. If you think about works like Kevin Kelly's Out of Control. And so I think that is part of where that post-disenchantment, a lot of it is coming from, is ways of thinking about these different kinds of technologies, like neural networks, and where the pieces are harder to see, and so that led in some instances to I think that kind of fed into this alternate way of conceptualizing control, and a sense that maybe we have to give up, as Kevin Kelly says in this book, that we have to give up the illusion of control over technology and just let it take us where it will. And interestingly, I think that synthetic biology actually, where it actually went since it emerged in the period that I was talking about, is against, it moved away from that model of control that was represented by the abstraction hierarchy towards more ways of working with directed evolution, where you're kind of pushing the system towards an end result, but not necessarily understanding completely how it's getting there. So that these ideas about black boxing, I think, were really important. Maybe also, this is a little bit more of a vaguer connection, but I also think there's something in this idea of the abstraction hierarchy where it enshrines ignorance, in that the engineer working only is really looking at one part of the system, and the other parts of the system are purposely kind of bracketed off. So I think that a lot of that enchantment discourse goes towards ways of coming to terms with, putting forward the idea that that's okay. Yes. Sorry.
Just kidding. Hi, thank you so much for your talk. It was super fascinating. And I wanted to hear about a little bit more like this idea of the superorganism, right? And it just seems in sort of different periods in science fiction, there are these different kind of figures or like creatures that come up, you know, that reflect the sort of social and political anxieties of the time, right? Like aliens, right? You know, and the other, and then we have this superorganism. Mm-hmm. And so I'm curious if there are other such figures, you know, that have come into greater prominence over the last couple of decades, and like which are those?
Oh, other tropes.
Yeah. In relation to this sort of topic.
Yeah. Well, while I'm thinking about that, I will say that the superorganism too is also kind of connected to the modern imaginations of technology with Brave New World. This idea that will be, that biotechnology would result in this kind of standardized system where everyone is a cog in the machine. And one of the things that the biohacking narrative really did was, through this concept of enchantment, it kind of makes us feel okay about that, about being a part of that, part of the superorganism in a sense, because of, in part, by utilizing these new theories of complex systems where the parts can contribute to emergent order without being totally top-down determined in a way.
Distributed agency.
Yeah. Yeah, so I'll have to come back. I'll put that in the back of my head and come back to that. I saw some hands over here. Yeah.
So, as a big science fiction fan, I've known that since pretty much starting in the 1930s, when science fiction started getting more sciencey, there has been a lot of back and forth between the science fiction people and the scientists. In fact, a lot of them are the same people. But it's been really interesting to see how in this field, with the changes in biology and manipulation, that it's been really getting much closer to, gee, you're reading the science fiction, but you can imagine that this could really be real. And you talked a lot about how the scientists and the science fiction people are kind of interacting and feeding back and forth.
Yeah.
That's the direct connection between them, but there's also a very important indirect connection, which is the science fiction authors write these very nice novels that get adopted into these abysmal blockbuster movies and really scare the heck out of everybody that watches them from this technology. And then the people who are watching this out in the public then get really irate at the scientists who are doing the real work and development. So you've got this kind of inner loop, but you've also got this kind of scary outer loop. And I'm wondering how much that outer loop you're seeing also detract from the relationship between science fiction and the scientists. And the scientists basically saying, stop writing that stuff because we won't be able to do our research anymore. Did you see any of that happening, or
Yeah, well, I definitely heard that message from synthetic biologists, and as we mentioned, that kind of has led more recently to a real pushback against the prevalence of dystopia. Although, yeah, I'm not sure if that's playing out in the kind of mass movie ecosystem as much. Yeah, one thing that's interesting about the more dystopic works is that I think they do often speak to anxieties about the relationship between science and technology that goes beyond just this specific fear of genetic engineering of a virus, like a super virus or something, right? I think they do reflect anxieties about larger questions about what's driving science and technology in some cases. So I don't like to kind of dismiss them as fear-mongering so easily. But another interesting thing to note about that is that some work has shown, I think a lot of synthetic biologists were inspired by Jurassic Park, right? So having a dystopic context doesn't actually, that's not always the message. That these things are remixed, right? They're taken out of context, and that can still end up being something that still serves as a hieroglyph that people want to work towards, even if in the film or the fiction it was a completely terrible, catastrophic thing. And yeah, some of the work on diegetic prototypes kind of supports some of that idea of things that context not necessarily translating. So yeah, I'm not sure what it does and what those kind of films, what effect they really have in terms of public perceptions. Yeah, you can speak to this.
The context around nanotechnology is very much like what you just described in a way. So Rosalind Byrne, University of Virginia, had done interviews very early on with self-identified nanoscientists and nanoengineers, and first found their inspirations in a lot of science fiction, and found exactly among the 30 or 40 that she followed very closely for about half a decade, that kind of context, that Jurassic Park, inspiration, was very much at play in this group of scientists. That it really didn't matter for them whether something was utopian, dystopic, or in between, perhaps in part because they had a mindset that they could fix it. That they saw the example of something going wrong, and they would not have, they would have a more redundant system. They would do something a little bit better than was described in the fiction. What also happened with nanotechnology that was really interesting was that there was exactly this particular, what one of my European colleagues characterized as the fear of nanofear among scientists and engineers who were supporting the large investments in many nation states for nanotechnology, particularly that Michael Crichton's Prey would be made into a movie. Now, a lot of us who read Prey were afraid that it would be made into a movie anyway, simply because of the weirdness of the narrative, but they were afraid that it would cause exactly this kind of backlash. And in part, that fear of nanofear among well-positioned scientists and engineers led to investments in the social studies of nanoscience and technology, which indirectly, or even more than indirectly, led to this group around this table through the Center for Nanotechnology and Society and the School for the Future of Innovation and Society coming out of those investments. So there's all sorts of weird outer loops here that go on around this fear that might be propagated.
Yeah, and one other thing is I wouldn't ascribe the fear just to the public either, because I think one of the really interesting things about this narrative of synthetic biology and technology converging in a kind of out of control manner is that the people who are kind of talking about this narrative didn't downplay the risks. Like in that interview where Drew Endy is talking about people living in gourd houses, he also says people will die. So he is kind of saying that there are real dangers, and yet we have to pursue this anyway, that it can't be stopped. That was basically the message. So, yeah.
Last question?
Thank you so much. This is a great talk. So when we were developing Hieroglyph, we came up with a set of guidelines for writers. It was no holocausts, no hyperspace, and no hackers. And we observed during the process and afterwards, it was interesting how hard it was to keep hackers out of it. That there's something about the notion of the individual rebelling against a broader system of control that is very compelling as a foundation of narrative. And I thought your juxtaposition with Joan Schlanchowski's work is really interesting, and it reminded me of this term. I don't know if you're familiar with the critic Alex Galloway, but he uses this really nice term, grammars of action, to talk about the kinds of things that are possible and in a given narrative, and he was actually using that in the context of video games. But I wondered if you could talk a little bit about that here. Carl Schroeder's story is one of the only ones that they were kind of hackers too, but it was a collective. It wasn't the individual, right? It was about a social movement and changing, as you pointed out, changing the collective process of meaning making. And so I guess this is a question about how we do this better, and maybe what the ends of the sort of the scientific enterprise, but also the ends of storytelling around the future are. Should we be encouraging people towards this sense of individual agency, which is, I think, what you're saying the biohackers are motivated by. Should we be encouraging joy? Because I think Rudy Rucker's work is kind of like, this should be a joyful future, even if a few people get killed. Or is it something like justice? Or is it something like collective wisdom?
Yeah. I think all of the above, hopefully. I hope there's a place for joy as well in these futures. But Joan Schlanchowski's novel also really does highlight processes of deliberation in that novel. And so I think, how we get there, especially given that that world is so different from our world, is a big challenge for science fiction writers. But I'm looking forward to seeing. I mean, I think many of the that kind of mid-2000s works like Paulo Bacigalupi's Wind Up Girl were very focused on issues of justice. And so it's kind of, yeah, I think it's about finding a balance between those kind of works that help us see the problems of the present in a different way, in a critical way, which critical dystopian work can do. And then because we have had so much of that already, and I think many of us do see the problems, works that can kind of open up new possibilities of alternatives. And yeah, it's a real challenge. I certainly don't have the answers. But,
well, thank you so much.